When you think about owning a castle, what comes to mind? Grand feasts in enormous halls, knights in shining armor, absolute power over vast lands, and rivers of gold flowing into your treasury? It sounds like the ultimate medieval fantasy. You probably imagine yourself as the lord of the manor, collecting taxes, commanding armies, and living a life of luxury that would make modern billionaires jealous. But here is the truth that every history book and movie conveniently leaves out. Owning a castle in the Middle Ages was not a ticket to wealth and power. It was a financial disaster. It was the medieval equivalent of buying a crumbling mansion in a prestigious neighborhood with a mortgage that eats your entire paycheck. Except the roof leaks. The plumbing does not exist. The property taxes are arbitrary and unlimited. And your neighbors might show up at any moment with battering rams and trebuchets to take everything you own. The romantic image of the castle lord is one of the most persistent myths in popular culture, and today we are going to tear it apart piece by piece. We're going to look at the real economics of castle ownership, the actual numbers, the actual costs, the actual revenue streams, and the actual catastrophes that could wipe out a noble family that had been wealthy for generations. By the time we are done, you will understand why many medieval lords would have happily traded their stone fortresses for a modest farmhouse and a peaceful life. So here is the main idea. A castle was not a home. It was not a status symbol. It was not a palace. A castle was a military installation with living quarters attached. It was a fortress designed to control territory, project power, and withstand a siege. And it was, without exaggeration, the single most expensive thing a person could own in the medieval world. The economics of castle ownership operated on a completely different scale from anything else in medieval society. A peasant family could get by on a few pounds or shillings a year. A prosperous merchant might earn tens of pounds annually. A castle cost thousands of pounds to build and hundreds of pounds per year to maintain. To put this in perspective, the annual income of a typical English baron in the 13th century was somewhere between 100 and 500 pounds. The construction of a single moderately sized castle could cost anywhere from 1,000 to over 10,000 pounds. That is 10 to 20 years of the baron's entire income spent on one building project, and the construction was only the beginning. Once the castle was built, the expenses did not stop. They barely slowed down. The real financial burden started the day the last stone was laid. A castle was a financial black hole that consumed money relentlessly, year after year, generation after generation. The only way to afford it was through a complex and often fragile system of feudal obligations, land management, taxation, and legal privileges that the lord had to maintain with constant attention. If any part of this system broke down, the consequences were catastrophic. The lord could lose everything, and the system was designed to break down. Medieval society was unstable, violent, unpredictable, and deeply unfair. The same system that made castle ownership possible also made it dangerously precarious. The lord who owned a castle was not sitting on a throne of gold. He was standing on a financial tightrope over a pit of debt, and one wrong step could send him falling into ruin. Let us start with the cost of building a castle from scratch. This was not a project you could finance with a mortgage or a construction loan. You paid for it with cash, and you paid for it up front. The first thing you needed was land, and not just any land. You needed a strategic location, usually a hilltop, a river crossing, or a coastal cliff. You needed to control the surrounding area, which meant you needed the rights to that land, and those rights came from the king, and the king did not give them away for free. Getting a royal license to crenellate, which was the permission to build a fortification, was a political and financial negotiation in itself. You might have to pay a substantial fee, pledge military service, or surrender other lands in exchange. Once you had the land and the license, you needed materials. A large castle required tens of thousands of tons of stone. That stone had to be quarried, which meant paying quarrymen, buying tools, and transporting enormous blocks of rock over rough medieval roads. Transport was the single biggest line item in the construction budget. Moving a single cartload of stone a few miles could cost more than the stone itself. You needed timber for scaffolding, floors, roofs, and defensive structures. The timber had to be cut from forests you owned or purchased, seasoned, shaped, and transported. You needed lime for mortar, which meant burning limestone in kilns, a process that consumed vast amounts of fuel. You needed iron for gates, hinges, bars, and nails. Every single nail in a medieval castle was hand-forged by a blacksmith. A large castle might use tens of thousands of nails. You needed lead for roofing, gutters, and water pipes. Lead was extraordinarily expensive, more costly than most metals, and a castle roof could require tons of it. Then there was the labor force. Building a castle was not a weekend project with a few helpers. It required a workforce of hundreds of skilled and unskilled laborers working for years. You needed master masons, the true experts who designed the structure and supervised the work. These were highly paid professionals, the medieval equivalent of architects and engineers. Their wages were several times those of ordinary workers. You needed stonecutters, carpenters, blacksmiths, rope makers, and carters. You needed general laborers to dig foundations, carry materials, and mix mortar. All of these people had to be paid, fed, and housed. Feeding hundreds of workers for years was a logistical operation that required its own infrastructure. The grain had to be grown, milled, baked into bread, and delivered. The meat had to be raised, processed, and cooked. The water had to be sourced and carried. The workers needed shelter, medical care, and tools that constantly broke and had to be replaced. The total cost of a major castle construction project in the 13th century could easily exceed £10,000. To give you a sense of scale, the entire annual revenue of the English crown in the early 13th century was around £30,000. So a single castle could cost a third of the entire kingdom's annual income. King Edward I spent over £80,000 building his castles in Wales, a project that bankrupted the English treasury and required new taxes that caused widespread unrest. That is the equivalent of a modern government spending billions of dollars on a single military base. And remember, this was a time when the average annual income of a peasant was about £2 or £3. The cost of one castle could have fed thousands of families for a decade. But the construction was only the down payment. The real cost started after the castle was finished. Once the castle was built and you moved in, the ongoing expenses were relentless. The single biggest recurring cost was the garrison. A castle needed soldiers. It needed men to guard the walls, man the gates, patrol the battlements, and stand ready to defend against attack. Even in peacetime, a castle required a minimum garrison of maybe a dozen to several dozen men, depending on the size and strategic importance of the fortress. These men had to be paid. An average foot soldier in the 13th century might earn a penny or two per day. That does not sound like much, but it adds up quickly. A garrison of 50 men at 2 pence per day costs about 100 pence per day, which is roughly 8 shillings per day, which is about £150 per year, and that is just wages. The garrison also had to be fed. Feeding 50 men 3 meals a day requires enormous quantities of food. You need grain for bread, barrels of ale, sides of beef and mutton, vegetables, salt for preservation, and spices to make the food palatable. The annual food bill for a modest garrison could easily be another £100 or more. Then there was the equipment. The soldiers needed weapons, swords, spears, bows, arrows, crossbows, bolts, shields, and armor. All of this equipment wore out, broke, or had to be replaced. Arrows were shot once and lost. Swords had to be sharpened and repaired. Armor rusted and needed maintenance. The armory was a constant drain on resources, and then there was the castle itself. A stone castle requires constant maintenance. The mortar between the stones erodes over time, especially in wet climates. The walls need repointing, which means hiring masons to replace the old mortar. The roofs leak. Lead roofing is durable but expensive, and it gets stolen. People would literally steal the lead off your roof. Timber rots, floors sag, stairs crumble. The moat, if you had one, fills with silt and needs dredging. The drawbridge mechanism jams and needs repair. The portcullis rusts and gets stuck. The well needs cleaning and deepening. The latrines, called garderobes, need to be emptied and maintained. This is not glamorous, but it is the reality of castle ownership. The annual maintenance budget for a medium-sized castle could easily be £50 to £100 per year. And that is if nothing major went wrong. Major repairs like a collapsed wall or a burned roof could cost hundreds of pounds on their own. The lord also had to maintain his own household. He needed servants, cooks, butlers, chamberlains, clerks, chaplains, and personal attendants. He needed horses, stables, and grooms. He needed robes, furs, and jewelry appropriate to his station. He needed to entertain guests because medieval politics ran on hospitality and gift-giving. When the king or a high-ranking noble visited, the lord was expected to provide a feast worthy of the guest status. A single royal visit could cost more than a month's income. The lord also had to pay his feudal obligations to the king. These included scutage, a tax paid in lieu of military service, and aids, which were extraordinary payments for specific events like the king's ransom, the knighting of the king's eldest son, or the marriage of the king's eldest daughter. These payments were not optional. They were legally required, and the amounts were set by the king. They could be ruinous. On top of all this, the Lord had to maintain his social position. He had to give gifts to allies, bribes to officials, and offerings to the church. He had to fund chapels, endow monasteries, and pay for masses for his soul. The medieval church was a major drain on noble finances. The expectation of charity and religious patronage was constant and expensive. When you add all of this up, the annual cost of owning and operating a castle was enormous. A typical baron might spend 200 to 500 pounds per year just to keep the castle functioning, and that is before any kind of luxury or lifestyle spending. The castle was a machine that consumed money, and if the money stopped flowing, the machine stopped working. So where did all this money come from? How did medieval lords afford this financial nightmare? The answer is a complex system of revenue streams that the lord had to manage, protect, and constantly fight to maintain. The foundation of castle economics was the land. The lord owned land, sometimes vast estates, and the land produced income. But the lord did not farm the land himself. He leased it to tenants. The most common arrangement was the manor system. The lord's estate was divided into manors, each managed by a steward or bailiff. Each manor had peasant farmers who worked the land. Some of these peasants were free tenants who paid cash rent. Others were serfs who were bound to the land and owed the lord a portion of their labor and produce. The lord collected rents in cash and in kind. He received a portion of the grain harvest, the wool clip, the milk and cheese, the eggs and poultry. He collected fees for the use of the lord's mill, the lord's oven, the lord's wine press. These monopolies, called banalities, were a major source of income. Every peasant had to use the lord's mill to grind their grain, and the lord took a share of the flour as payment. This was a guaranteed income stream, reliable and predictable. The lord also collected tolls. If the castle controlled a bridge, a river crossing, or a road, the lord could charge travelers and merchants a fee to pass. These tolls could be substantial, especially on busy trade routes. The lord collected market fees. If the castle had a market town attached, the lord could charge merchants for the right to sell their goods. He could charge for stalls, for weights and measures, for the right to trade. Markets were a major source of income for castle lords. The lord also had legal rights. He held the court of the manor, and he collected fines from peasants who broke the law. A fine for a minor offense might be a few pence. A fine for a serious crime could be substantial. The lord also collected fees for legal services, for registering documents, for witnessing marriages and wills. The lord could collect revenue from the forest. Forests were valuable resources, providing timber, firewood, game, and grazing land. The lord could charge fees for the right to cut wood, to hunt, to graze animals. The lord could also sell timber, which was a valuable commodity. The lord had the right to collect tallage, which was a tax on his peasants. This was a direct tax that the lord could impose at his discretion. Usually in times of need, the peasants hated it, but it was legal and it was a significant source of revenue. The lord could also collect aid from his free tenants, similar to the aids the king collected from the lord. This was an extraordinary tax for specific purposes, like the lord's ransoms or the marriage of his daughter. The lord could also collect relief, which was a fee paid by an heir when they inherited land. This could be a substantial sum, often a year's income from the estate. The lord could collect wardship income if a tenant passed away and left a minor heir. The lord took control of the land until the heir came of age. The lord kept all the income from the land during this period, and he could also sell the marriage rights of the heir. This was a lucrative but controversial practice. The lord could also collect equite, which was the return of land to the lord when a tenant passed away without an heir. This was rare, but when it happened, it was a windfall. The lord could also engage in trade. Some lords invested in wool production, which was the most valuable export of medieval England. A lord with large flocks of sheep could make a fortune from the wool trade. Other lords invested in mining, salt production, or fishing rights. The most successful castle lords were those who diversified their income streams and managed their estates efficiently. A well-run estate could generate hundreds of pounds of income per year, enough to support the castle and the lord's household. But even the richest lords were often cash poor. Most of their wealth was tied up in land, goods, and livestock. They did not have large reserves of cash. They lived from harvest to harvest, from rent collection to rent collection. A bad harvest could mean a year of financial hardship. A series of bad harvests could be catastrophic. The Lord's financial position was always precarious, always dependent on factors beyond his control. The weather, the market, the king's demands, the behavior of his tenants, all of these could affect his income. And the Lord had very little ability to adapt. He could not easily change his revenue streams. He could not sell his castle quickly if he needed cash. He could not lay off his garrison. He was locked into a financial system that was rigid, fragile, and unforgiving. And then there were the disasters, the things that could ruin a castle owner financially, sometimes permanently. The first and most obvious disaster was war. If your castle was attacked, the costs were enormous. Siege warfare was incredibly expensive. You had to feed your garrison, pay their wages, and stockpile supplies for the duration of the siege. A siege could last months, even years. During that time, you could not collect rents from your lands because the peasants could not farm. The fields were burned, the livestock was taken, the villages were destroyed. The economic damage of a siege extended far beyond the castle walls. If the siege was successful and your castle was taken, you could lose everything. The castle might be slighted, castle, which means deliberately damaged to make it unusable. The walls could be breached, the towers pulled down, the gates destroyed. Repairing this damage could cost as much as building the castle in the first place. And if you were captured, you would have to pay a ransom. Ransoms for nobles were set according to status and could be astronomical. A king might be ransomed for tens of thousands of pounds. A baron might be ransomed for hundreds or thousands of pounds. The ransom had to be paid in cash, often within a short period of time. Families were ruined by ransoms. They sold land, borrowed money, and stripped their estates of every asset to free their lord from captivity. The second great disaster was the king. The king was the biggest financial threat to any castle owner. The king could demand military service, which meant the lord had to leave his estates and fight in the king's campaigns. This was expensive. The lord had to equip himself, his knights, and his soldiers. He had to pay. For their transport and supplies, he had to leave his castle under the command of a deputy, which cost money. And while he was away, his estates were not being managed as effectively. The king could also impose taxes, the king could demand scutage, aids, and other payments at any time. The king could also fine the lord for offenses real or imagined. The king could seize the lord's lands for any reason, real or fabricated. The king could simply decide that he wanted the castle for himself. Many castles were taken by the crown through legal maneuvering, political pressure, or outright force. The king could also force the lord to marry his children to people chosen by the king, which could be financially disastrous if the marriage came with expectations of dowries or settlements that the lord could not afford. The third great disaster was the weather. A bad harvest was a financial crisis for a castle lord. If the harvest failed, the peasants could not pay their rents the lord had to feed. Them anyway, because peasants who could not farm produced no income. The lord might have to buy grain at inflated prices to feed his household and his garrison. A series of bad harvests, like those that occurred during the great crop failure of 1315 to 1317, could be devastating. Prices soared, incomes collapsed, and many lords went bankrupt. The great crop failure affected millions of people across Europe, and it also destroyed the finances of countless noble families. The fourth disaster was disease. Livestock diseases could wipe out a lord's herds. Sheep murrain, cattle plague, and other animal diseases were common and devastating. A lord who had invested heavily in wool production could lose his entire flock in a single season. This was a financial catastrophe that could take years to recover from. The fifth disaster was inflation. The medieval economy was not stable. Prices could fluctuate wildly. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, Europe experienced a period of rapid inflation. The cost of food, labor, and materials rose sharply, while the income from fixed rents and feudal dues did not keep pace. Lords who had leased their lands on long-term fixed rents found their real income declining year after year. They were caught in a cost squeeze, with expenses rising and revenues stagnating. The sixth disaster was legal trouble. The medieval legal system was complex and expensive. Lords could be sued by their tenants, by the church, by other lords, or by the king. Lawsuits could drag on for years, consuming time and money. Legal fees, bribes, and settlements could run into hundreds of pounds. A lord who lost a lawsuit could face massive damages or the loss of valuable lands. The seventh disaster was family. The lord's own family could be a source of financial ruin. He had to provide dowries for his daughters. A dowry for a noble daughter could be hundreds of pounds. He had to provide for his younger sons, who might need to be established in Careers in the church or the military, he had to support his widowed mother, his unmarried sisters, and his other dependent relatives. The extended family was a constant drain on resources. And then there was the lord's own lifestyle. Many lords spent beyond their means. They built more castles, hosted lavish feasts, bought expensive clothes and jewelry, and funded extravagant religious foundations. They competed with other lords in displays of wealth and status. This competition was a driving force in medieval culture, but it was also a source of financial ruin. Lords who tried to keep up with their neighbors often ended up in debt. And debt was a serious problem in the Middle Ages. There were no bankruptcy laws, there were no debt relief programs. If you could not pay your debts, you could lose your land, your castle, and your freedom. Creditors could seize your assets, the king could take your lands, you could end up in prison. The medieval world was unforgiving to the debtor, so what was the bottom line? What was it really like to own a castle in the Middle Ages? The truth is that it was a burden, not a privilege. It was a responsibility that weighed on the lord every single day. The castle was not a home, it was a fortress, a prison, a symbol of power, and a target for enemies. It was a financial obligation that consumed the lord's income and demanded constant attention. The lord who owned a castle was not a king in his own little kingdom. He was a manager, a bureaucrat, a military commander, a judge, a landlord, and a debtor, all rolled into one. He had to supervise his estates, collect his rents, manage his tenants, maintain his castle, command his garrison, administer justice, and navigate the treacherous waters of medieval politics. And he had to do all of this while constantly worrying about money. The medieval castle lord was in many ways the equivalent of a modern small business owner who has taken on too much debt to buy a fixed asset that is too expensive to maintain. He was asset rich and cash poor. He owned a magnificent stone fortress, but he could not afford to heat it, repair it, or defend it. He was trapped in a financial system that was designed to keep him perpetually short of cash, perpetually dependent on the king, and perpetually vulnerable to disaster. The romantic image of the castle lord is a fantasy. The reality was a life of constant financial pressure, constant political maneuvering, and constant risk. The castle was not a reward for success. It was a test of endurance. Most lords passed that test through a combination of careful management, political skill, and sheer luck, but many failed. The history of the Middle Ages is filled with the stories of noble families who rose to power, built magnificent castles, and then collapsed into debt, disgrace, and obscurity. Their castles still stand in ruins across Europe, monuments to ambition and reminders of the brutal economics of medieval power. So the next time you see a castle in a movie or a video game, remember what it really represents. It is not a symbol of wealth and luxury. It is a symbol of debt, risk, and the crushing weight of responsibility. The lord who lived in that castle did not have a comfortable life. He had a hard life, a stressful life, a life that was shaped by the constant struggle to keep his castle running and his family afloat. The castle was his greatest achievement and his greatest burden, and that is the real story of the economics of castle ownership in the Middle Ages. A story of stone, sweat, and silver. A story of ambition, fear, and endurance. A story that reminds us that the things we build to protect ourselves can also become the things that consume us.